Have you ever wondered if ancient knowledge could hide technological secrets that even our most advanced scientists haven't discovered yet? What if I told you that a group of British engineers working on classified military projects accidentally stumbled upon a Native American canoe design that would change everything we know about modern naval engineering? Before I continue with this shocking revelation that's been kept hidden for decades, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and subscribe to our channel. We need your support to continue sharing these untold stories that powerful interests want to keep secret. In the autumn of 1963, a team of naval engineers from the British Royal Navy's Classified Advanced Maritime Research Division arrived in Massachusetts. Their mission was simple yet ambitious: to study indigenous watercraft designs as part of Operation Northern Horizon, a little-known Cold War initiative to develop unconventional military vessels. Led by Commander Jeffrey Harrington, a decorated veteran with 20 years of experience in experimental naval design, the team set up operations in a nondescript warehouse near Plymouth Harbor. Ironically, the same waters where Native Americans had paddled their canoes for thousands of years before European settlement. "We were looking for any advantage we could find against the Soviets," recalled Dr. Eleanor Winters, one of the few surviving members of the original research team, in a recently declassified oral history recording. "The Americans had given us access to several preserved specimens of indigenous watercraft, but none of us expected to find anything truly revolutionary. We were humoring our superiors, to be honest." The team's initial focus was on a remarkably preserved birch bark canoe recovered from Assanet Lake in southeastern Massachusetts in 1958. According to local records, the canoe had been discovered in an underwater cave by two teenage boys, preserved almost perfectly in the oxygen-poor environment. Carbon dating revealed it to be approximately 300 years old, likely constructed by Wampanoag craftsmen during the early colonial period. What made this particular canoe unusual was not just its remarkable state of preservation, but certain anomalies in its construction that defied conventional understanding of indigenous craftsmanship. The inner hull featured a series of seemingly random ridges and channels carved into the wooden frame, patterns that initially appeared decorative, but would later prove to be anything but. Professor Thomas Blackwood, an anthropologist from Harvard University who specialized in Native American material culture, was brought in to consult. "The patterns inside this particular canoe didn't match anything in our records," Blackwood noted in his journal. "Initially, I suspected it might be clan markings or spiritual symbols, but the mathematical precision suggested something else entirely." The engineers began by creating detailed measurements and drawings of the canoe, focusing particularly on the unusual interior patterning. Harrington insisted on building an exact replica for testing purposes, adhering to traditional methods as much as possible. This meant harvesting birch bark from the correct season, using split spruce roots for binding, and applying pine resin mixed with charcoal for waterproofing. All techniques learned from historical records and consultation with remaining Wampanoag craftspeople. What happened next would change the course of naval engineering, though it would remain classified until the early 21st century. During the first water trials in April 1964, engineers noticed something extraordinary. The replica canoe moved through water with significantly less resistance than any mathematical model predicted. Initially, they assumed measurement errors or testing anomalies. However, after repeated trials under varied conditions, the results remained consistent. The canoe was demonstrating hydrodynamic properties that, by all contemporary understanding of fluid dynamics, should have been impossible. "I remember Harrington's face when we compiled the third set of test results," Dr. Winters recalled. "He went completely white, checked the figures again and again, then locked himself in his office for 3 days with nothing but coffee and cigarettes. When he emerged, he simply said, 'We need to understand the patterns.'" The team's focus shifted entirely to the mysterious interior ridges and channels. Using the emerging technology of fluid dynamics modeling, they began to understand that the seemingly random patterns created a sophisticated boundary layer manipulation system that significantly reduced drag. In simple terms, the water flowing along the hull was being guided in ways that modern engineering had yet to discover. By June 1964, the implications had become clear enough that the project's security classification was elevated to the highest level. The American military partners, who had initially regarded the project as a curiosity, suddenly became intensely interested. General William Crawford, from the Pentagon's Advanced Research Projects Agency, arrived unannounced at Plymouth with a team of scientists and security personnel. "Everything changed when Crawford showed up," said Marcus Thompson, a junior engineer on the project. "Suddenly, we had armed guards, daily security briefings, and all our communications were monitored. That's when we realized we'd stumbled onto something massive." What the team had discovered was that the internal patterning created what would later become known as micro-vortex generators, tiny, precisely shaped channels that created controlled turbulence patterns in the boundary layer of water flowing past the hull. This controlled turbulence, counterintuitively, dramatically reduced the overall drag on the vessel. The principles at work would eventually become part of modern hydrodynamics, but in 1964, they were decades ahead of contemporary understanding. The question that haunted the research team was how Native American canoe builders, working without modern fluid dynamics theory or testing equipment, had developed such sophisticated engineering. Some team members suggested it was simply trial and error over centuries, while others proposed that the design might have been a lucky accident. Harrington, however, became convinced that the Wampanoag and other coastal tribes had developed a sophisticated understanding of water flow that had been lost to history. Determined to find answers, Harrington and Blackwood began interviewing elderly members of the Wampanoag tribe, hoping to find any remaining traditional knowledge about canoe building. Most of their inquiries led nowhere. Generations of forced assimilation and cultural suppression had erased much of the traditional knowledge. However, in August 1964, they met 92-year-old Joseph Running Water, living in a small house near Mashpee. The interview with Running Water would become legendary within the classified project. According to Blackwood's notes, the elderly man smiled knowingly when shown photographs of the canoe's interior patterns. "My grandfather called it speaking to the water," Running Water reportedly said. "The water tells you how it wants to move, if you know how to listen." Those marks are words in the language of water. Running Water explained that certain tribal canoe builders were specifically trained to understand water flow, using techniques that combined observation, intuition, and knowledge passed down through generations. These builders would spend hours watching how water moved around obstacles, studying the patterns formed by currents, and even feeling the flow with their hands while blindfolded to develop a tactile understanding of fluid dynamics. The most skilled builders were said to be able to see the invisible patterns in water the way others might see trails in a forest. The interior designs weren't random, but were specific to the waters where the canoe would be used. Different patterns for river currents versus open ocean swells. This revelation stunned the engineers. They were facing the possibility that Native American craftsmen had developed an intuitive understanding of advanced fluid dynamics, principles that Western science had yet to formalize. For Harrington, it was both humbling and exciting, evidence that there might be entirely different approaches to engineering problems than those taught in modern universities. As the team continued their research through the fall of 1964, they began adapting the principles observed in the canoe to experimental hull designs. Computer modeling was in its infancy, but even primitive simulations showed that the micro-vortex generating patterns could reduce drag by up to 30% when properly implemented, an improvement that would revolutionize ship design if it could be scaled up. The project took an unexpected turn in November, when the team received an urgent directive to investigate potential applications beyond naval vessels. Recently declassified documents reveal that NASA had become interested in the principles, recognizing potential applications for reducing drag on rocket fuselages during the atmospheric portion of spaceflight. By January 1965, the Plymouth warehouse had become the center of a multi-agency research effort involving the British Royal Navy, the U.S. Navy, NASA, and several classified defense contractors. The original Canoe, now recognized as one of the most important technological artifacts of indigenous American culture, was subjected to increasingly sophisticated analysis using the most advanced technology available. It was during this intensive research phase that the team made their second breakthrough. Using newly developed high-speed cameras to observe water flow around test models, Dr. Winston Chen, a fluid dynamics specialist brought in from MIT, noticed something unexpected in the separation patterns as water moved past the hull. The water doesn't just flow more efficiently around the hull, Chen noted in his research journal, it actually separates from the surface at precisely controlled points, creating what appears to be a partial cavitation effect without the negative consequences of traditional cavitation. In conventional naval engineering, cavitation, the formation of vapor-filled cavities in a liquid, was a serious problem that caused inefficiency and damage to propellers and hulls. What Chen had observed was that the Native American design somehow created controlled microcavitation zones that reduced drag without causing damage, something that should have been impossible according to the fluid dynamics understanding of the time. This discovery sent shockwaves through the research community. If the principles could be understood and replicated, it promised not just evolutionary, but revolutionary advances in maritime technology. The potential military applications were immediately obvious. Submarines that could move faster and more silently, torpedoes with extended range, and surface vessels with dramatically improved fuel efficiency. As 1965 progressed, the project expanded further. Testing facilities were established in Narragansett Bay, Rhode Island, where larger-scale models could be tested in open water. The research team grew to include over 100 scientists, engineers, and military personnel from both Britain and the United States. The project, now codenamed Flowing Water, had become one of the most significant collaborative research efforts of the Cold War that the public knew nothing about. In March 1965, tragedy struck the project. Joseph Running Water, who had become an important consultant to the team, passed away quietly in his sleep. Before his death, however, he had shared one final piece of information that would prove crucial. He mentioned that certain sacred sites along the Massachusetts coastline had been used for generations as training locations for canoe builders, places where the water flow created visible patterns that demonstrated the principles they sought to master. Harrington became obsessed with locating these sites, believing they might hold additional insights. Working with historical maps and Running Water's vague descriptions, the team identified 3 potential locations. 2 proved disappointing, but the third, a narrow inlet near present-day Westport, demonstrated unusual water flow patterns during certain tide conditions. When we arrived at the inlet during the falling spring tide, we finally understood, Dr. Winters recalled. The water moving through the narrow channel created visible patterns, standing waves, spiral eddies, and flow separations that perfectly demonstrated the principles we'd been struggling to understand mathematically. The location was a natural fluid dynamics classroom. At this natural site, the team made another connection. The patterns carved into the canoe's interior appeared to be stylized representations of the water flow patterns visible at the inlet during specific tidal conditions. The ancient builders had created a physical reference guide, encoding their observational knowledge into the very structure of their vessels. By the summer of 1965, the first experimental vessel incorporating these principles was ready for testing. The Water Talker, as the engineers nicknamed it, was a 20-foot composite hull craft that looked conventional from the outside but incorporated the microvortex and controlled separation principles derived from the Native American canoe. Its performance exceeded even the most optimistic projections, achieving nearly 40% greater fuel efficiency than comparable vessels while maintaining structural integrity under extreme conditions. Military interest in the project intensified. By August, both the American and British navies were developing plans to incorporate the principles into next-generation submarine designs. The potential advantage in the underwater arms race with the Soviet Union was too significant to ignore. However, as the military applications expanded, tensions emerged within the research team about proper attribution and respect for the indigenous knowledge that had made the breakthroughs possible. Blackwood, in particular, argued passionately that the contributions of Native American engineering should be acknowledged and that the Wampanoag tribe should receive recognition and compensation for their intellectual property. "We're building on knowledge that these people developed over thousands of years," Blackwood wrote in a memo to project leadership. "To classify it all and pretend we discovered these principles is not just dishonest. It's a continuation of the colonial theft that's defined our relationship with indigenous peoples." His concerns were noted but largely dismissed by military leadership, who considered the national security implications paramount. The knowledge would remain classified, the Native American origins downplayed in official documentation, and the technology developed strictly for military applications. As 1965 drew to a close, the project entered a new phase. Having proven the principles worked, the focus shifted to understanding the fundamental physics at a deeper level and developing mathematical models that could be used for computer-aided design of future vessels. This work would continue in secret for years, gradually influencing naval architecture through classified channels. For Commander Harrington, however, the project had become more than a military research initiative. He had developed a profound respect for the indigenous knowledge system that had accomplished through observation and intuition what modern science was still struggling to understand with advanced mathematics and computer modeling. "There's an entire alternative engineering tradition that we've ignored," he wrote in his personal journal in December 1965. "Who knows what other solutions Native Americans and other indigenous peoples developed that might help us address our modern challenges? And what right do we have to take this knowledge without acknowledgement or compensation?" These questions would haunt the remainder of Harrington's career. Though the technology developed through Project Flowing Water would eventually revolutionize naval design through classified military applications throughout the 1970s and 80s, the indigenous origins of these advances would remain unacknowledged for decades. Harrington, increasingly troubled by the ethical implications of the project, began documenting everything in a personal journal, creating a parallel record outside official channels. This journal, containing detailed technical information alongside his moral reflections, would become a time bomb ticking away in the classified history of the Cold War. "What we've found here isn't just a better way to build boats," Harrington wrote in his final journal entry before being reassigned in January 1966. "It's evidence that we've been looking at the world through a very limited lens. The Wampanoag didn't just build canoes, they developed a relationship with water that allowed them to understand it in ways our equations are only beginning to capture. There's something profound here that goes beyond hydrodynamics, something about different ways of knowing that might be even more valuable than the technology itself." With those words, Harrington closed his journal and locked it away, never suspecting that 40 years later, it would spark one of the most significant controversies in the history of engineering and indigenous intellectual property rights. But that part of the story, how these revolutionary principles finally emerged from the shadows of classification and transformed modern naval engineering while raising profound questions about knowledge, credit, and cultural appropriation, was still decades in the future. As the first phase of Project Flowing Water concluded and the technology moved into classified military applications, the original birch bark canoe that had started it all was quietly placed in secure storage at a facility in Maryland, its significance known only to a handful of people with the highest security clearances. To the outside world, it remained simply an interesting artifact of Native American craftsmanship, its revolutionary secrets hidden in plain sight for another generation. But unknown to the military researchers who thought they had controlled all information about the project, someone else had been watching, someone who understood exactly what had been discovered and what it meant, not just for naval engineering, but for understanding how knowledge moves through history and across cultures. Someone who had connections to both the indigenous knowledge keepers and the highest levels of military research. And this person had begun making their own plans for how this knowledge should be preserved and shared. As the classified project Flowing Water transitioned into military applications in 1966, the public narrative around indigenous technologies remained unchanged. Museum displays continued to present Native American canoes as primitive craft, remarkable for their simplicity rather than their sophisticated engineering. Meanwhile, in secret facilities across America and Britain, engineers were revolutionizing naval design using principles they had extracted from what they now understood to be one of the most advanced hydrodynamic designs ever created. The person who had been watching these developments with particular interest was Dr. Rebecca Tallwood, a brilliant naval engineer with mixed Wampanoag and European ancestry. Tallwood had been recruited to work on tangential aspects of Project Flowing Water in 1965, without being granted full access to the program's core research. Despite the compartmentalization, her exceptional understanding of fluid dynamics and her cultural background had allowed her to piece together what was actually happening. They brought me in because of my expertise in boundary layer analysis, Tallwood would later recall in her memoir, but kept me away from the original artifacts and the anthropological research. It didn't take long to recognize the signatures of traditional Wampanoag water knowledge in the test models I was analyzing. The military had found something my grandfather's people had known for centuries, and they were pretending it was a new discovery. By 1967, the first submarine incorporating the indigenous-derived technology was under construction at the Electric Boat Shipyard in Groton, Connecticut. Disguised as a standard modernization project, the USS Narragansett was designed to be the quietest, most efficient attack submarine in the American fleet. Similar efforts were underway in British shipyards, where the HMS Challenger was being built with the same principles. Dr. Tallwood, meanwhile, had begun her own parallel research project, using her grandmother's connections within the Wampanoag community and her academic position at MIT. She started collecting oral histories from tribal elders across New England. Without explicitly revealing what she knew about the classified project, she focused her questions on traditional understanding of water movement, fishing techniques, and canoe building. What emerged from these conversations was a fragmentary but profound body of knowledge that extended far beyond what the military researchers had uncovered. The water-speaking tradition, as it was called in some communities, wasn't limited to canoe design, but informed fishing practices, weather prediction, and even agricultural irrigation systems. In the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy tribes further north, similar traditions had informed the design of fishing weirs and river navigation techniques. What the military extracted was just one application of a much broader knowledge system, Tallwood noted in her research journal. They saw a technology to exploit, but missed the holistic understanding of water systems that informed it. It's like finding a single page torn from an encyclopedia and thinking you've got the whole book. By 1968, the Cold War applications of the technology had expanded dramatically. In the Nevada desert, a secret testing facility code-named Ripple Site had been established to explore applications beyond maritime use. Researchers discovered that the same principles that reduced drag in water could be applied to airflow, potentially revolutionizing aircraft design. NASA had begun incorporating elements of the technology into next-generation spacecraft designs, and DARPA was exploring applications for everything from missile systems to underground bunker ventilation. Commander Harrington, now promoted to captain and serving as technical director for advanced submarine systems at the Pentagon, watched these developments with increasing discomfort. His personal journal, maintained in violation of security protocols, documented both the technical advances and his growing ethical concerns. "We've created an entire research ecosystem around this knowledge without a single acknowledgement of its origins," he wrote in October 1968. "Billions in defense contracts, thousands of researchers, multiple nations involved, all building on indigenous knowledge that we're officially pretending doesn't exist. The scale of this appropriation is staggering." His concerns extended beyond simple credit. As the research advanced, Harrington had come to believe that the Western scientific approach was actually limiting full understanding of the principles involved. The reductive, compartmentalized approach of modern engineering was struggling to capture the integrated, systems-based understanding that had informed the original Native American design. "We keep hitting walls in certain applications because we're forcing these principles into our existing paradigms," he noted, after a particularly frustrating research review in early 1969. The original knowledge wasn't just about hydrodynamics in isolation. It integrated understanding of materials, environmental conditions, propulsion methods, and even the human interaction with the vessel. "We've extracted one piece and can't figure out why our applications sometimes fail in unexpected ways." As the 1970s began, the technology began finding its way into operational military systems. The USS Narragansett had completed sea trials, demonstrating unprecedented stealth capabilities. A new class of torpedo using the technology could travel 50% farther than previous models while leaving almost no wake signature. British Special Operations had developed a small craft for covert insertions that could move through coastal waters with near-perfect silence. While these military applications proceeded, Dr. Tallwood continued her parallel research. By 1972, she had assembled enough traditional knowledge from various tribal sources to begin developing her own applications of the principles, focused on environmental rather than military uses. Working with a small team of trusted colleagues at MIT, she designed prototype systems for river restoration, flood control, and water purification that incorporated the indigenous understanding of water movement. "The military sees this knowledge as a weapon," she wrote in her research notes. "I see it as a healing technology that could help address the damage we've done to natural water systems. The same principles that make a submarine quieter could help us restore damaged rivers, protect coastlines, and develop sustainable irrigation systems." The parallel tracks of military application and Tallwood's environmental research continued through the mid-70s, neither group fully aware of the other's advances. In 1975, however, the situation changed dramatically when Captain Harrington suffered a massive heart attack at his Pentagon office. As he was rushed to Walter Reed Medical Center, his aide, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Wilson, was tasked with securing the classified materials in Harrington's office. While gathering documents from Harrington's safe, Wilson discovered the personal journal documenting the entire history of Project Flowing Water, including Harrington's ethical concerns and his comprehensive technical notes. Wilson, who had worked closely with Harrington for 3 years and shared many of his misgivings about the project, made a fateful decision. Before turning most of the materials over to security personnel, he quietly removed the journal and several key technical documents. 2 weeks later, as Harrington lay recovering in the hospital, Wilson visited him with news that would change everything. "I know about the journals, sir," Wilson said quietly, after ensuring they weren't being overheard. "And I think I've found someone you should meet. Someone who understands what we've been doing from the other side." That someone was Dr. Rebecca Tallwood. Wilson had attended a public lecture she gave at Georgetown University on indigenous engineering principles and modern applications, and had immediately recognized veiled references to the same technology they had been developing in secret. After the lecture, he had approached her cautiously, revealing just enough to establish their common interest. The meeting between Harrington, Wilson, and Tallwood took place in April 1975 in Harrington's private hospital room after visitors' hours. For security purposes, Wilson had swept the room for listening devices, and they spoke in low voices, often referring to technical concepts in coded language. Over 3 hours, they shared their respective knowledge and concerns, realizing they had each been working on complementary aspects of the same technology. It was like finding missing pieces of a puzzle, Tallwood would later write. They had the detailed technical applications and the military developments, while I had the cultural context and the broader systems understanding that explained why certain approaches worked better than others. Harrington, still weak from his heart attack but intellectually sharp, proposed an unprecedented plan. This knowledge doesn't belong to the military, and it shouldn't be classified, he told them. It belongs to humanity, with proper acknowledgement of its indigenous origins. We need to find a way to bring this into the public sphere. The plan they developed over the following months was both ambitious and dangerous. Harrington would continue his military role while gathering comprehensive documentation. Wilson would serve as the conduit between Harrington and Tallwood, passing information that would help her develop parallel, non-classified applications of the technology. And Tallwood would prepare academic papers establishing the indigenous origins and environmental applications of the principles, ready to publish when the moment was right. They called their conspiracy Project Truthflow, a play on both the original military code name and their mission to allow the truth to finally flow into public awareness. By 1977, their preparations were well advanced. Tallwood had assembled a compelling body of research linking modern fluid dynamics concepts to traditional indigenous knowledge. Harrington had collected thousands of pages of technical documentation, carefully smuggled out of classified facilities by Wilson. They had also identified several journalists and academic allies who could help disseminate the information when the time came. The trigger for their plan came from an unexpected source. In March 1977, a minor security review at the Maryland storage facility led to the rediscovery of the original Wampanoag canoe that had started the entire project. Routine carbon dating was performed to verify its provenance, and the results were shocking. The canoe was significantly older than originally believed, dating to approximately 1400 CE rather than the 1700s. This discovery elevated the significance of the artifact enormously. If the hydrodynamic principles had been developed in the pre-Columbian period, it meant that Native American engineers had been centuries ahead of European understanding of fluid dynamics. For Harrington, this was the final moral impetus needed to move forward with their plan. They didn't just precede us by decades, they were ahead of us by centuries, he wrote in a note to Tallwood. The historical record needs to be corrected. Their opportunity came in September 1977, when a conference on hydrodynamics and naval engineering was scheduled in Boston, bringing together academic researchers and military engineers from across NATO countries. Tallwood, as an established MIT professor, had been invited to present a paper on boundary layer analysis in marine applications. She prepared a seemingly conventional academic paper that, while technically accurate, contained no classified information. What the military security officers reviewing her presentation didn't recognize was that her mathematical models and experimental data, while derived from her own research, perfectly aligned with the classified work. Any engineer familiar with the secret programs would immediately recognize the connection, while those without that background would simply see innovative but conventional research. On September 23, 1977, Tallwood delivered her presentation to a packed auditorium at MIT. In the front row sat representatives from the Office of Naval Research and DARPA, there to monitor presentations for security concerns. In the middle of the room, disguised as a visiting professor from UCLA, sat Thomas Wilson, ready to gauge reactions. And in the back, anonymous among other attendees, was a reporter from the Boston Globe, who had been briefed to recognize the significance of what was about to happen. Tallwood began conventionally enough, discussing boundary layer dynamics in marine applications. 20 minutes into her talk, she smoothly transitioned to historical context. These principles, which we're only now beginning to formally understand through advanced mathematics, have interesting historical antecedents, she said casually. In particular, examination of pre-Columbian Wampanoag watercraft reveals sophisticated manipulation of boundary layer dynamics that anticipated modern computational fluid dynamics by centuries. She then displayed detailed analysis of water flow patterns around traditional canoe designs, connecting them directly to the most advanced concepts in contemporary hydrodynamics. Without explicitly mentioning classified programs, she had effectively revealed their foundational principles and correctly attributed them to indigenous engineers. The reaction was immediate. The naval representatives looked alarmed, frantically taking notes and whispering to each other. Several academic engineers in the audience who had worked on classified aspects of the technology sat frozen, recognizing immediately what she was revealing. And the reporter from the Globe, following the briefing he had received, understood that he was witnessing a major scientific and historical revelation. "I'll never forget the faces in that room," Wilson later recalled. "It was like watching a paradigm shift happen in real time. You could see people putting it together, realizing that fundamental principles they'd been taught were Western discoveries had actually been developed by indigenous engineers centuries earlier." Before the naval representatives could intervene, Tallwood concluded her presentation and opened the floor for questions. The first came from Professor James Lightfoot of Caltech, who had consulted on classified applications of the technology for DARPA. "Dr. Tallwood," he asked carefully, "are you suggesting that the advanced boundary layer manipulation techniques developed over the past decade in Western naval engineering were anticipated by Native American canoe designs?" "I'm not suggesting it," Tallwood replied calmly. "I'm demonstrating it mathematically and historically. The evidence is conclusive." The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. The Globe published its story 2 days later under the headline, "Navy's Secret Submarine Tech Discovered in Ancient Indian Canoes, MIT Professor Claims." Other media outlets quickly picked up the story. The Navy and DARPA issued the expected denials, claiming that Tallwood's research was interesting but unconnected to any classified programs. But within the engineering community, the revelation was impossible to dismiss. Within weeks, academics around the world were examining indigenous watercraft with new eyes, finding similar principles at work in everything from Polynesian outrigger canoes to Inuit kayaks. A paradigm shift had begun in how Western engineering viewed indigenous technologies, not as primitive precursors, but as sophisticated solutions developed through different but equally valid knowledge systems. For Harrington, Wilson, and Tallwood, the aftermath brought both vindication and challenges. All three faced investigations and potential prosecution for security violations. Tallwood's academic career was temporarily derailed by legal challenges from government agencies. Harrington was forced into early retirement, and Wilson was reassigned to a remote naval facility in Alaska. However, the knowledge was now irreversibly in the public domain. Throughout the 1980s, the principles derived from indigenous watercraft designs gradually transitioned from classified military applications to commercial and environmental uses. Ship designers incorporated aspects of the technology to improve fuel efficiency. Environmental engineers applied the principles to river restoration and coastal protection systems. Aerospace companies adapted the concepts for aircraft design. By the early 1990s, the military classification of the original research had become unsustainable. In 1993, as part of a broader post-Cold War declassification effort, most of Project Flowing Water was officially acknowledged and declassified. The original Wampanoag canoe was transferred from military storage to the Smithsonian, where it was displayed with a plaque acknowledging its revolutionary significance in the history of engineering. In 1995, a formal acknowledgement and apology was issued to the Wampanoag Nation, along with establishment of the Indigenous Engineering Knowledge Fund, which provides scholarships and research grants to Native American students in engineering fields. The fund also supports documentation and preservation of traditional indigenous technical knowledge across North America. For Tallwood, now in her 70s, the recognition brought a sense of completion to a life's work. It was never about discrediting Western science or claiming indigenous superiority, she explained in a 1997 interview. It was about acknowledging that human ingenuity has many paths, and that we all benefit when we recognize and respect different knowledge traditions. Captain Harrington did not live to see the full vindication of his ethical stance. He passed away in 1982, still under investigation for security violations. However, in 2001, he was posthumously awarded the National Medal of Technology and Innovation for his role in bringing indigenous engineering principles into modern application. His personal journal, once a classified security violation, is now preserved in the Smithsonian as a key document in the history of engineering ethics. Commander Wilson, who retired from the Navy in 1987, went on to establish the Cross-Cultural Engineering Initiative, an organization dedicated to documenting and preserving indigenous technical knowledge worldwide. What we found with that single canoe was just the tip of an iceberg, he noted at the initiative's launch in 1990. Across the world, indigenous peoples developed sophisticated technologies adapted to their environments, most of which we're only beginning to understand and appreciate. By the early 2000s, the principles derived from the Wampanoag canoe had become standard elements in engineering curricula worldwide, typically presented alongside their indigenous origins. The technology had found applications far beyond its original maritime context, from medical devices that regulate blood flow to architectural systems that manage air circulation in buildings. In 2005, the most comprehensive study yet of the original canoe was conducted using advanced scanning and computational modeling techniques not available during the original research. The results revealed additional subtleties in the design that even the intensive Cold War research had missed. The study, led by a team that included both Western-trained engineers and traditional Wampanoag knowledge keepers, demonstrated that true understanding of the technology required both knowledge systems working in collaboration. The Western approach excels at quantifying and modeling the what and how of the technology, explained Dr. Michael Runningbear, a Wampanoag engineer who co-led the study. But the indigenous understanding better captures the why, the integrated systems thinking that connects the technology to its environment and purpose. Neither approach alone gives the complete picture. This collaborative approach to understanding indigenous technologies has since become a model for similar research worldwide. From studies of Incan agricultural engineering to investigations of traditional Chinese seismic-resistant architecture, the field of ethno-engineering has emerged as a respected discipline bridging anthropology and technical fields, documenting and analyzing the engineering achievements of cultures worldwide. For the Wampanoag people, the recognition of their ancestors' achievements has brought both pride and a renaissance of traditional knowledge. Community programs now teach young tribal members both the practical skills of traditional canoe building and the sophisticated understanding of water dynamics that informed their design. Several tribal members have gone on to careers in hydrodynamic engineering, bringing their cultural perspective to cutting-edge research. Our ancestors weren't just building boats, they were developing a relationship with water, based on deep observation and understanding, explained Elizabeth White Deer, a Wampanoag elder who helps lead the tribe's cultural knowledge program. That relationship informed everything from how they fished to where they built their settlements. What looks like simple technology to outside observers actually represents thousands of years of sophisticated observation and adaptation. In 2010, the story took another remarkable turn when previously unknown documents emerged from Soviet archives. These revealed that Soviet intelligence had been aware of Project Flowing Water almost from its inception, having placed a spy within the research team. The Soviets had developed their own parallel research program, which had resulted in the advanced hull designs used in their Alpha-class submarines of the 1970s. This revelation completed the historical irony. The technology that American military researchers had sought to keep classified had not only been developed centuries earlier by indigenous engineers, but had also been independently discovered and implemented by their Cold War adversaries. The principles that each side had treated as critical military secrets had been hiding in plain sight in traditional watercraft around the world. Today, the legacy of that single Wampanoag canoe discovered in Assinet Lake continues to expand. Its principles have informed designs for everything, from Olympic racing boats to space station cooling systems. The original canoe itself, carbon dated to approximately 1400 CE, remains one of the most studied artifacts in the Smithsonian collection, recognized as both a masterpiece of indigenous engineering and a turning point in the relationship between Western and traditional knowledge systems. For engineers, historians, and indigenous communities alike, the story serves as a powerful reminder that innovation is not the exclusive domain of any single culture or approach to knowledge. As humanity faces unprecedented global challenges, from climate change to resource depletion, the integration of diverse knowledge traditions may offer our best hope for developing sustainable solutions. The revolutionary breakthrough that British engineers discovered in that Native American canoe design wasn't just a better way to move through water. It was a different way of understanding our relationship with the natural world, a way that might have been lost forever, if not for the curiosity of those engineers and the courage of those who fought to ensure the true origins of the knowledge were recognized. As we continue to explore indigenous technologies from around the world with new respect and understanding, who knows what other revolutionary principles await rediscovery? What ancient wisdom might help us solve modern problems? And what might we achieve if we approach these discoveries not as opportunities for exploitation, but as invitations to collaboration across cultures and knowledge traditions? Perhaps the most important lesson from this remarkable story is that true innovation often happens at the intersection of different ways of knowing. When we have the humility to recognize that our own tradition, no matter how sophisticated, is just one path to understanding the world around us. In the wake of these revelations, interest in indigenous knowledge systems has expanded far beyond engineering. Pharmaceutical researchers are investigating traditional medicinal plants with new respect for the sophisticated understanding that informed their use. Agricultural scientists are studying traditional farming methods that maintained soil health for centuries without chemical inputs. Architectural engineers are examining how indigenous buildings achieved comfort and durability in extreme environments without modern technology. What began with a single canoe has grown into a fundamental reassessment of how we value and integrate different knowledge traditions. And for many indigenous communities, this shift has brought not just recognition, but renewed cultural confidence and economic opportunities. In 2015, the Wampanoag Marine Innovation Center opened in Massachusetts, combining traditional knowledge with modern research to develop sustainable maritime technologies. Staffed by a mix of tribal members and international researchers, the center has pioneered advanced hull designs for everything from fishing vessels to scientific research ships, all incorporating principles derived from traditional canoes. We're not just preserving the past, we're building on it, explained Center Director Sarah Three Rivers at the opening ceremony. Our ancestors weren't finished innovating, and neither are we. They would want us to take their knowledge and continue developing it to meet the challenges of our time. As we face unprecedented global challenges requiring innovative solutions, Perhaps this story's most important lesson is that human ingenuity takes many forms, and our best hope lies in bringing these diverse traditions into respectful conversation with each other. The revolutionary canoe that changed modern naval engineering reminds us that sometimes the most advanced technology isn't found in the latest research lab, but in the careful observations and accumulated wisdom of those who came before us. When we open our eyes to different ways of knowing, we may discover that revolutionary breakthroughs have been waiting for us all along, hidden in plain sight in the ingenious technologies of cultures we once dismissed as primitive. And in that recognition lies the potential for a more humble, collaborative, and ultimately more innovative approach to solving the challenges that face us all. For those who seek wisdom in these uncertain times, perhaps there's no better guide than the words Joseph Running Water shared with the British engineers so many years ago. The water tells you how it wants to move, if you know how to listen. In our fast-paced world of technological complexity, sometimes the most revolutionary breakthrough is simply learning to listen to nature, to each other, and to the wisdom preserved in traditions different from our own. May we all find the humility and courage to listen, learn, and work together across the boundaries of culture and knowledge traditions. For in that collaboration lies our greatest hope for navigating the turbulent waters that lie ahead. And in acknowledging the genius of those who came before us, we honor not just their achievements, but our shared human capacity for observation, understanding, and innovation. As you reflect on this remarkable story of discovery, appropriation, revelation, and ultimately reconciliation, consider what other wisdom might be waiting to be rediscovered, and how your own perspective might be enriched by seeking understanding across different ways of knowing. For in the end, the most powerful technology may not be found in the newest device or latest algorithm, but in our human capacity to learn from each other across the boundaries of time, culture, and tradition. Follow God and Jesus Christ, for in their wisdom lies the ultimate path to understanding the wonders of creation and the purpose behind all knowledge, whether revealed through science, indigenous wisdom, or divine inspiration.